Hi everyone, welcome back to the Casual Watch Review channel. So in this week's episode, I've got a really interesting interview for us, one that I've been looking forward to doing for a while. Now, I cover a whole host of watch genres on the channel, including military watches and also aviation watches. Now, in the past when I've done these, I've had a few comments around, have I ever been in the military? And I personally haven't been in the military. So today's interview, I am lucky enough to be interviewing a Naval Flight Officer who's currently serving in the US military. So Chris, thank you for joining us today.
Sam, it's my pleasure to be here.
One of the questions I always love to start with is, tell us a bit about how you got into watches before you served in the Navy. Were you into watches before that?
Yeah, so for me, and I'll kind of start off that this is just going to be one person's experience and point of view, so it is limited to what I've seen and what I've experienced, and in no ways does it represent the opinions or anything or the position of the U.S. government or the Navy or the Department of Defense. But that said, for me, my experience with watches really wasn't. I wasn't really a fan or a hobbyist. I started flight school and looked for a watch that would help me graduate flight school to the best of my ability, really. So I was just really looking for a tool, the way that someone goes to Home Depot looking for a power drill. There wasn't anything special about it. There's no heritage or design aesthetics that I was looking for. I just needed something very functional. Flight school was pretty intense and competitive, and I wanted to get the kind of grades that would get me the aircraft I wanted. So I took it really seriously and wanted to do really well. So in a certain phase of the syllabus, timing was really critical, and you really needed something extra to what the aircraft had to offer in terms of the instrumentation in the cockpit. And so I turned to just a simple $30 multifunction digital watch, really simple, but had everything I needed. I needed a chronograph, I needed the second time zone, and so I used that. So it wasn't until later I did a full tour in the fleet, a 3-year tour with combat flying, all with the same kind of watch. But then when I came back to instructor duty, I met an RAF Tornado navigator. He was on exchange to our squadron as another instructor, and I saw that he had the Seiko Gen 2 quartz analog chronograph, really cool looking, military looking analog chronograph, and I immediately it kind of jumped out at me. I noticed it's like, what's that? And he explained it to me, and I asked him where I could get one, and he said it was issued, and he even couldn't keep his. And so on a later journey to the UK with him as a little exchange tour I took, I looked around for the watches, never encountered one. Now, of course, online I could find one, but the price is a little bit high for a watch that old. So I never pulled the trigger on them. But that's what got me thinking about them, got me looking at them as more than just the tool that you bring to the cockpit. And the journey kind of continued from there.
That's interesting. We see a lot of watches that say military issued and things like that on the Marathon, and a few other brands spring to mind. So when you joined the military, they didn't issue you with a watch as part of your kit?
No, they didn't. And they actually specified that it was a required item, but there was nothing issued. We went to this, down in Pensacola, for me, it went to this big old issue hanger and got all kinds of stuff, but the watch wasn't part of it. And so really it was up to you to get your own. Now, I do know that some militaries issue watches, and I do follow those as an enthusiast, if you will, and I find them interesting, but no, disappointingly, the U.S. military has not done that. It's probably just a matter of scale, I assume, or cost, but that just leaves it up to us to purchase our own.
Oh, that's really a shame. What I'll do during the course of this interview is I'm going to splice in some amazing pictures that Chris has sent over to me. So I know one of the first questions I'm probably going to get, or that we're probably going to get, is what type of aircraft did you fly in?
So I started out, so the trainer aircraft, not that glamorous, but it's interesting because they're all gone, the T-34, T-39, and T-2. So these are just small trainers. But then in terms of fleet combat aircraft, it's the EA-6B Prowler, and the follow-on platform from that, the E-18G Growler. Most of my flight time's been in the Prowler, all my combat time and deployed time's been in the Prowler. And then in my last tour, I transitioned to the Growler towards the end of the tour. So I got a little bit of a taste of the more modern aircraft, but these are essentially electronic warfare aircraft. They suppress enemy systems that are targeting our forces and essentially sort of provide a clear path for our forces, ground or air or naval, to do their mission without being destroyed, essentially. So we provide a blanket of protection.
And in those aircraft, they obviously have their own timekeeping instruments. Are they made by a brand that we would know of?
most of the time, you're just looking at a digital time feed on a display that's multifunction. But in the Prowler, we had 3 Waltham mechanical clocks, so we call them 8-day clocks. 2 in the front cockpit, 1 for the pilot, 1 for the right seater, and in the back cockpit they shared 1. So this is something that you would see in a World War II aircraft or in a Spitfire. A simple analog time display, a knob that you would turn to wind it, and then also to push and stop the chronograph. So really a simple, clear display, mechanical 8-day clock.
You mentioned that you started off with a Timex watch. How did that evolve? Did you go for, after the Timex, did you go for more luxury watches, or were you more concerned with the type of complications and functionality of the watches?
Yeah, so from the multifunction digital types, and I saw a lot of folks with Casio, G-Shocks, Timexes, all those sorts. From that, for me, I did bounce around a little bit. So I next looked at the luxury watches, and because some of my squadron mates turned me on to the sort of the mystique around more expensive heirloom level watches. In fact, when I was in Afghanistan, I hit 2,000 hours on a given day, and on that day, through the exchange online, I ordered a luxury watch that essentially my wife was pregnant with my firstborn when I was deployed to Afghanistan, and so I came home to a newborn, and also came home to the watch that he's going to get when he's older. So that's pretty neat, and I like that fact that they represent an heirloom. In fact, kind of got turned on to that idea by another aviator with me in Afghanistan who was wearing a very old vintage watch that he'd gotten from when his father passed away, and it was obviously very special to him since it was something that reminded him of his father. The watch that I was actually flying with in Afghanistan, though, was quite different. It was an analog digital multifunction watch, a Navihawk. It's not made anymore, but I thought it was pretty darn near perfect. It had chronograph, multiple time zones. It even had an analog second time zone display. And one of the neat things is that you could adjust the watch in the settings so that it could manage a half time zone. And since Afghanistan is, I think, 4.5 hours ahead of Zulu time or UTC time, any watch that didn't compensate for that half-hour difference would just mislead you. So it was really neat that I could set it like that. All our flight operations are on Zulu time. That's true for the military. It's true for the FAA. But when you're walking around the base deciding when you have time to go get breakfast, that's on real world or current time zone time. So you do need to live in 2 worlds time-wise. So I thought that watch was really useful on deployment. So
we talked about the watches that you do use. Now, I always imagine that aviators would use the Breitling Navitimers, or even Seiko make the Flightmaster. And I had a Hamilton X Patrol that had, I think you could work out the fuel burn. It had a number of scales on the bezel. Are they a gimmick? How useful would they be to somebody that's in your role?
They are useful, but for me personally, and it's very dependent on the aircraft you fly, your crew position in that aircraft, what your duties are, whether or not you're going to use something like that. So I think they're a legitimate feature, so I don't want to dismiss them. But for a military tactical jet aviator at the speeds we're flying, the kind of things we're doing, and with the training we've received, I'm not going to use those. So I think they're just going to clutter things up a little bit and really interfere with legibility. So that would be a choice that I wouldn't make for a watch with that feature. I'd rather have a more pure dial. And part of the reason for that is that fuel calculations you mentioned, or crosswind, or any of those other types of things that those bezels are designed to provide for you, that's something the military gives us a lot of training on essentially doing in our heads. So I'll give you an example on fuel. It's really not that difficult because you're seeing your indicated airspeed, which you convert to true airspeed with a quick mental math on your altitude. That's all you need to adjust that. Then you adjust true airspeed to ground speed by your winds, and you kind of determine your miles per minute off of that. And so, okay, now you know roughly how many miles left to go to your next point. That tells you exactly how much time it's going to take, and then you look at your fuel flow rate on your engines, and that's your burn rate per hour in thousands of pounds. So it's just some math, but eventually, and you do it, you don't do it to the pound, right? You're doing it to significant levels. And so when you're talking fuel in a jet, you're really looking at thousands and hundreds of pounds, not tens or ones. So you really learn quick techniques to do the math quickly in your head, and you can do that a lot faster than you could work out a very tiny bezel on your watch. But I know that, I think, for example, I thought the Navitimer was designed for private pilots back in the 60s or 50s. And I think that given the lack of instrumentation and the lack of military style training, maybe those pilots definitely enjoyed having that feature. I don't think you're going to see a lot of jet tactical military aviators working out stuff on their bezels.
What would you say is the most useful complication for the type of role that you performed, and how would you use that?
So I think the first thing is I want and need really accurate current time to the second. I need to be able to hack it because we do synchronize with each other. I know you see that in movies where people are going to synchronize their watches. We don't do it as with one person necessarily making everyone do it, but we have sources where we can synchronize our watches too. And I'm speaking from carrier aviation, but we will do that before every flight because there are certain, basically the aircraft carrier's flight schedule is very schedule driven with key events. Usually the primary sort of marker in time is the launch and recovery time for your event. And you build back from that for when you're going to start your engines, when you're going to check in with your flight lead, when you're going to leave the PR shop and head up to the flight deck and start your pre-flight. All those things are measured back all the way to the brief, which is also on you're doing it in your ready room potentially or in a big group, like it's kicking off exactly at a certain time and it's broadcast on the ship's TV channels to each ready room so that everybody sees the same details such as weather, winds, and all that. So, for me, I do need high legibility of the current time with seconds that are hackable. So that's something I value. Elapsed time is really useful. It certainly was more useful when I was in aircraft that had more rudimentary navigation that was more drifty. But, that maybe 10 years ago. Nowadays, navigation is a lot more tight in the aircraft. And so I'm not really having to start and stop a stopwatch for navigation purposes, but I still like to have it because in emergencies, we do have procedures that reference time. They might say, if this caution light's been on for this long, do this. And if it's been on for less than that, do something different. So you sort of reach a fork in the road based on the clock. And that's even in modern aircraft today, although, going back to my training, it has always been a mantra that once you see any kind of caution light or emergency in the aircraft, you start the clock, and because you'll need to reference that. When you get a lot of adrenaline and dealing with an in-aircraft emergency, your sense of time in your head is going to be distorted. So I think that's one of the reasons they taught us to take a deep breath, start the clock, and then now you have a reference, and quite useful in certain emergencies. If let's say for example you lose your fuel gauge, you had a sense of how much fuel your engines were burning. You can actually do some of that quick fuel math and figure out how much fuel you probably have left, even if your display of your fuel quantity was gone. Little things like that. So it's not a feature I need right now. I could easily comfortably go flying without a stopwatch, but I would want to have it. I would want to have some good loom too, because especially on the ship, whether inside the ship or on the flight deck at night, it gets really dark. So I'd like to have loom. But I would not like to have a light source. So like push a button and the light comes on, because I think that would, I've got a lot of time on night vision goggles, and having anything that would light up would interfere and cause distortion and just kind of mess things up. And we keep our cockpits really dark at night to enhance our night vision. And I wouldn't want to mess with that with a light source. So just some straight up loom would be ideal for me on that.
Is there an ideal watch, or if you could design an ideal watch for military aviation, have you had a thought about what it might look like?
Yeah, there probably isn't one ideal. But I guess I would say there's an ideal for me. And right now I tend to focus more on heritage and design. And, right now I'm kind of leaning on the old German Flieger style or the old RAF styles, like the Mark 11 style. I just find something beautiful and about their simplicity and simple seems to be better for me. But in terms of if I were to really design one for the standpoint of max functionality in the cockpit, I would make it an analog digital watch. I like to be able to see the time in both of those formats. I've seen some where they're analog digital, they just have a single crown actuation. I think that'd probably be fine in most cases, but just for folks wearing gloves, I think, and just for the feel without looking down to be able to actuate your stopwatch without having to look at your watch, I would like to have push buttons for start stop. So yeah, analog, digital, good loom on the analog portion of it. The digital part would have all the usual stuff. Give me a countdown timer, a stopwatch, and at least one other time zone, and then the date, that kind of thing for just normal wear. And then that's really about it. Just the overall the need. There's not a huge need for particular features, so everyone's mileage really varies here.
So we talked about watches now. What about the straps? Do you leave your watches on the stock straps, or do you switch out the straps for something that's more practical?
Yeah, I go for more practical. I've hardly ever used the factory strap, so I almost exclusively wear the NATO style strap. Since about 2008, and the Afghanistan deployment was the first one where I wore that all the time, and it was just super convenient, comfortable, light, just everything you'd possibly want. And another cool thing I noticed is when I did some flying in the waters off Virginia in January, where the temperature was really cold, and you wouldn't survive a overwater ejection for very long if you couldn't get out of the water, just that cold. In those situations, we wear a dry suit for exposure protection, and it has thick wrist cuffs. So, most people just chose not to wear a watch in those situations, or they put it in somewhere else. But I actually just kind of wowed a few folks in the PR shop getting ready for a flight, say, "Hey guys, look at this," and have the strap go over the cuff, and you're great. And so that it was really neat and satisfying to kind of see the NATO do what it was supposed to do. I'm a diver too, so I've always used them and appreciated how they fit over a wetsuit, but it was cool to see them fit over a flying dry suit as well.
We talked about complications on a watch. One that I've always thought about, especially on an aviation watch, is sometimes you see brands that have the homing beacons inside them, like the rescue type watches. Is that something that's used for, or is that something that you'd, like a separate piece of equipment you'd have on you anyway?
So yeah, not going to discount that one. It is. I mean, look, I wouldn't use it. I've seen people in the military that had them. I think they're super useful for private pilots and folks that don't have a lot of rescue equipment with them. I think the military gives us all we need for rescue gear, every possible thing you could want. But I certainly understand someone thinking, hey, things break, and I would like to have a little bit extra. I think it might turn out more often than not that someone would inadvertently actuate that system and end up in trouble for it, or having to apologize for inadvertent actuation, more likely than they would actually use it to save their lives. But then again, I'm certainly not going to make fun of anyone that gets one, because one day if they end up saving their life with it, then all the more power to them.
Okay, so we've covered the functionality of a watch, what an ideal watch would be like. What about these larger watches? Would you have a larger watch because it's more legible and more robust?
Yeah, I think you could make a good case for the size, for a larger size for legibility. That certainly, I would rather get my legibility from the simplicity of the dial and the contrast and just how well it was designed, because there is a risk. The larger the watch, there is a little bit of a risk of it getting caught up on things. So coming from ejection seat aircraft, I would be nervous if the watch was a bit too oversized, that it would end up being a thing that caught on something during an ejection, or even thinking about if in any ejection part of your body is not tucked in tight when you go, the wind force is so strong that it kind of carries that part of the body and causes injury. And so just adding a large weight toward the end of your watch, I think, would just sort of make that even worse. So, and I think there have been cases of aviators injuring their hands because in an ejection their watch caught on something and didn't give. So, I kind of make fun of the larger watches. I call them hockey pucks, and I just say I don't want to wear a hockey puck. So I'm kind of a 40 millimeter guy, and I know that a lot of the Aviator watches are in the 42s, which is a good size, I think, for the average person. And my wrist may be a little bit smaller than the average, so I think that's a good region. But you start getting the 45s and above, and I understand that the old World War II Fliegers were massive, but I also they were designed in a different way when people didn't have climate controlled cockpits, and they really had very bulky gear, and so really they were carrying around in a way a piece of the aircraft, not just a personal timepiece. But everybody else flew with much smaller watches.
So you've just talked about some of the Flieger watches. It was my understanding that in the more rudimentary airplanes, they used watches actually for navigation. Is that true?
Yeah, it is, and so that's something I learned to do in flight school. So, and the way we did that was through visual navigation, or oftentimes at low level, where you pre-plot a route on a chart, and so you measure out all your distances, your headings, and then you're flying at low level, where everything is visual navigation. So, off of landmarks, headings, and we use the mantra there: clock, chart, ground, and that's exactly how you navigate. You reference your time. So you start an elapsed time clock at the beginning of the route. And so it's hard to get lost if you keep up with your clock. So that's, you check out where am I on time? And then look at the chart. Where does the chart say I should be at this time? And then you start looking around. What are the features I need to be looking for? You acquire those features, you orient yourself. And the whole secret to it was all the mental math you had to do, because if there were no winds, it should be quite easy. You set your speed and you fly the route. But of course, winds push you off course. And as your route goes in different headings, on one leg you might have a strong headwind, on another leg it might blow you to the right, and so on. And so you'd have to figure out the magnitude of the winds based on the deviation you saw, and then you would apply a correction to future route portions of the route based on your estimate of the winds, and ultimately you try to arrive on target at the time that you wanted to be there. So it was a pretty delicate art, and it really relied heavily on the clock. And then, I was lucky that as I got into more and more sophisticated aircraft, it was a beautiful thing to see that the aircraft tells you time to go to your next turn point. Having had to do that all in my head, it was a beautiful thing to have the airplane do it for you. And at that point, you're basically backing it up, because if you don't back it up, you just say, I trust the airplane. If it has a failure in the navigation system, you might end up quite far from where you want it to be, and in pretty unsafe places, because you didn't sanity check your own aircraft, right? So I then learned to use my stopwatch as a backup. And then as the aircraft got even better than that, then the need to really provide that assurance over the aircraft diminished significantly as it got even more and more reliable. So today, I'm doing that a lot less, but I still remember that art of using the clock for navigation.
We had an interesting conversation before this about how significant a watch is to pilots, navigators, aviators after you've left the military. So I'd love to, if you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it predates me, this idea that aviators look at a watch as at least back in the day, as maybe a flashy way of letting you know while they were dressed in normal clothes that, by the way, I'm a pilot or an aviator, as a matter of pride. I think there's some element of truth to that, but I think there's a lot less of that from what I see. For me, it's a way to carry with you your passion and your love, and if you see someone wearing an Iron Man T-shirt or a Steelers jersey, it's really no different than that. You're proud of something, you love it. It's part of you, and it's your passion, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to take it with you. We can't fly all the time, and at some point we have to stop flying forever, which is pretty sad to admit. But that moment comes, and so the watch becomes that part of you that you keep with you, that is a daily reminder, a constant reminder, and to be able to look down on your wrist and say, I flew with this, and then one day give to a son or grandson and say, your dad flew with this. Pretty neat thing, right? So it's, for me, it's more of an internal meaning. It's not about what other people see it as. And in fact, I would imagine the average person in the public looks at a watch and has no idea that whether it's a pilot watch or not, except those of us who are super passionate about the hobby, but the rest of the folks don't. And so it's really not about the public perception, more as the meaning that it has for the individual. That's kind of how I see it.
That was absolutely fascinating. Guys, if you've got any questions, let us know in the comment section down below. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Sam, it was absolutely my pleasure to share just my own personal one-man's journey, but I hope it helps other folks to hear about it.
As always, guys, I really appreciate any comments you've got. If you want to contact me directly, you can contact me on any of these social media links or directly at thecasualwatchreviewer@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on the Casual Watch Review channel. Thanks, guys. Bye.